I'm extremely pleased to be joined here by Houssein Djirdeh. He's a senior software engineer at Google working on the Chrome Aurora team. And he blogs at web.dev, which is a fantastic software educational resource that if you haven't checked out, I would encourage you to check out. He joined Google in 2018 as a developer advocate and serving in that role until he transitioned to senior software engineer just last year in 2022. And Chrome is unquestionably the leader in modern browser tech. And Hussein has been a dedicated steward of that technology for a number of years and the community. So I'm especially delighted and honored to have Hussein here today. So welcome, Hussein.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. It's my very first fireside chat. I've done a lot of talks at conferences, so I think this is great. I want to have fun, so I appreciate you inviting me.
Absolutely. It's absolutely my pleasure. And we did have 3 talks just before this, and our time is brief. So I want to jump right into the conversation. I'd like to start with the Chrome team's goal. The stated goal for Chrome, at least from a blog post that I read, is to make the web better. It's a broad goal, ambitious. Can you give us a broad overview of the principal methods that the Chrome team leverages to make the web better?
For sure, yeah. I think if we wanted to characterize or describe our mission in one sentence, I think exactly what you said is right. Chrome wants to make the web better for you, right? For the user, for the developer, for anyone using the web. And there are a set of core principles that everyone in Chrome kind of follows. One being that we need Chrome to be fast, right? It needs to be speedy. And that's one of the differentiators of what made Chrome special when it first came out, right? Like it was a very fast browsing experience. Another, that it needs to be secure, right? As a user, if you're going on Chrome to do your banking, to do anything private, you want to have confidence that the browser is making sure that everything you're doing is in a secure environment.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. The third would be simplicity, right? I think another differentiator of Chrome when it first came out years ago was that it was very simple to use. There's so much inherent complexity in the engines, right? In the JavaScript engine, in the rendering engine, in the layout engine. But as a user, you're not exposed to any of that. You're using the browser, you have the most simplest process, and that's the main idea. And then the fourth one would be stability. As a user or a developer, you would expect Chrome to always give you the same type of behavior. You wouldn't want to log into Chrome or use Chrome on a different day and just see different behavior on your web, or even if you're like working on certain APIs, expecting those APIs to change. So the fourth pillar would be stability, right? Chrome needs to stay stable. Even though there's so many changes happening behind the scenes, it has to be stable. So those 4 principles are kind of like the driving forces of every effort that happens in Chrome, whether you're working on the iOS version of Chrome, the desktop version, whether you're working on the metric side. Everybody on Chrome essentially is doing something to improve one of these core pillars.
Very good. And it seems like the Aurora, which we'll now move into in our conversation, is downstream from these core principles. And Aurora was announced at the, well, let's back up. The Web Framework ecosystem and Aurora, which are basically the same thing. So at the Chrome Developer Summit in 2019, you announced on stage alongside, if I can get this right, Shubi Panikkar, the Web Framework ecosystem. The Chrome team would start working directly with non-Google web frameworks. And in 2021, you gave this project an official name, Aurora. So let's start with the early days of the Aurora project, then called the Web Framework ecosystem. Why did the Chrome team decide to start working directly with frameworks?
Yeah, I think that's like a main question that we get, and it's a very good question. Like, why is there a team in Chrome working with other tools that aren't, built by Chromies or Googlers? So yeah, we had a lot of ideas very early on. We had a lot of names: Web Framework Ecosystem. One of our names was Web SDK, and then Aurora kind of, I think, was a newer name that we kind of used for our internal and external branding. So I can kind of give some context of when I joined Google, and maybe I think that will give some more background. So I joined Google as developer advocate, like you mentioned. I was in the web team under Chrome. And before I joined Google, I was always using frameworks. I was always using React. I was using a lot of Angular. So even though I was under a team that wanted to improve performance for the web, I always had a framework standpoint, right? Like, what can developers that use React do to make sure their sites are fast? What about developers that use Angular, and so forth? While I was doing that, I think a lot of the things, and this still happens to this day, right? Like, developer relations is super important. How do you tell developers about newer APIs that come out in the browser, but also how they can keep using the tools that they use to make sure they're shipping good experiences? And then I think myself and a few other people, Shubi being one of them, Nicole Sullivan, Adi Osmani, a lot of people in Chrome had this sort of idea of, we tell developers a lot of the time what they need to do, right? What about actually improving the tools that they use? So a lot of people in Chrome do a ton of research on the web, right? Like, we try to look at how many sites are using React, for example, right? How many developers are using tools like Redux or libraries? And if you look at the sheer number, it's huge. Like, the ecosystem is massive. So we've come to the realization that there's always going to be a focus for developers that they want to use tools to make the developer experience better, right? So how can we make sure that the tools that they use is even better to a point where they don't need to think about all these new APIs to improve performance or security or anything, right? I think of it as, in an ideal world, if the work that we do in Aurora is perfect, we wouldn't have to tell developers about what they need to do, right? The tools will do it for them automatically. Yeah. That's a very long process. It's going to take a significant amount of time to get there, but I think that's the ideal scenario. We had a lot of early ideas. One thing that we thought of was, should we ship our own framework? Like, should we create a new one that we think has all the right developer experience and user experience hooks automatically? We thought about even open sourcing some of the Google frameworks internally. And then we thought, instead of trying to do and create a brand new framework for developers to use, why not tap into existing tools? So then we did some research. We very quickly found that React had the larger share of the framework ecosystem. And then a lot of meta frameworks, or wrapper frameworks, I think there's a lot of different terminology here, like Next.js, Gatsby, Remix, and so forth. They were doing a lot of the things that we told developers to do. You should server-side render your routes. You should try to ship as little JavaScript as possible. You should think about lazy loading things, right? So we made the decision that instead of trying to create something new, we'll try to improve the tools that already exist, and that kind of started our relationship with the React and the Next.js teams.
So when we're talking about frameworks, we're not just talking about what we think of frameworks as React developers, like Next.js and Gatsby. We're talking about the core libraries themselves. React, which to this day claims not to be a framework, but let's assume that falls under this definition of framework. So you're working with the React teams directly, you're working with the Next team directly. Can you tell me about the other teams you're working with and the other frameworks?
Yeah, we work with the Angular team as well, even though Angular is a Google framework. But the Aurora Chrome team is a separate entity, so we try to work with them to the best of our ability. We have conversations with the Vue team. We also meet with the Nux team quite often. So I think the actual way to describe our work is, we want to improve open source tools. Whether it's a framework, whether it's a UI library, I think all of that doesn't necessarily matter initially. It's the idea of, if developers are using tools, how can we improve those tools so that they automatically get the benefits without worrying about any additional overhead? That being said, we found out that the best way for us to actually ship these optimizations is on frameworks that have more control of the entire stack, right? Like you mentioned, React, a lot of people refer to as a UI library. It's a lot harder trying to ship something in React that you want to get a lot of adoption, right? Either we can ship a plugin, we can tell developers, hey, we have this thing you can npm install. That's one route. But a lot of developers also just like using things like Next.js because it does a lot of these things automatically, right? So even though it has more control over the whole stack, we can try to improve that so that developers, when they're already reliant on a tool that does everything, they can get all these optimizations automatically.
Absolutely. So you're working with frameworks to improve the web. What is your benchmark? Is it all about core web vitals?
Yeah, so we're a very small team, and there's a lot of things we can improve. So we definitely wanted to start with performance being one of them. Like, how could these frameworks automatically just get better performance? And then there's a whole separate discussion of how do you measure performance, right? And then, like you mentioned, Web Vitals is a set of metrics that a lot of people in Google and even externally use to describe how performant a site is. And then core web vitals is a number of these web vitals, and they give a good holistic umbrella of how performant a site is, right? Like how fast is paint, how quickly can actual content render on the screen, how much are things shifting, so there's a layout shifting, that's another metric, and then how fast are things being interactive when you click on something or interact with the page. So these three are kind of the descriptors for core web vitals, and we use that as a benchmark, right? Like any of the work that we do, can we accurately say, okay, we've shipped something, and developers are now seeing better core web vitals, and then again, the ideal way would be for them doing absolutely zero work. There's always going to be some instances where they'll need to do something, they'll need to opt in, but we try to minimize that gap because developer experience, we think, is a really important thing to actually get better user experience.
This is extremely interesting. How exactly are you working with these teams, these companies, these open source communities? I mean, it's a whole ecosystem, multiple companies. Some of them are driven by specific companies. Of course, Angular is driven by Google, Facebook drives React, et cetera. So how does that relationship actually work? Talk to me about how that works.
That's a great question. So very early on when we decided, okay, we're going to try and improve existing frameworks instead of trying to ship anything of our own, we reached out first to the Next.js team, had a number of meetings with them. We were very pleased to see that a lot of our goals align with their goals, right? They, among other things, want to make sure that Next.js is a very performant framework for its users. And a lot of the ideas that we had, they shared, right? They were like, okay, we want to make sure that anybody using Next.js has minimal overhead and they get all these performance optimizations baked in. So that was a good start. And then we had more and more meetings. Now we try to meet at least once a week. We've had a long, I would say a couple of year relationship with them. And I think what we try to do, and we've made mistakes, we're not perfect, we try not to step on their toes, right? Because at the end of the day, they have their own milestones, right? They have their own things they need to work on. And we never want to make it seem like, okay, here are these set of engineers from Chrome coming in and telling us what we need to do, right? Like that's a bit of a slippery slope, right? Because we never want to come off and give that impression that here are a number of Chromies telling us what we should be doing and just breathing down our necks. Yeah. So we try our very best to understand what their roadmap is. A lot of the times they'll share what their thinking is. Even if they can't share exact specifics, they'll kind of tell us overall what they're trying to do for the coming year. And then we'll share exactly what we want to do. And then we'll try to find things that align, right? A good example could be the image component. Alex, one of the engineers on our team, had the idea of, okay, what if there was a component that could automatically optimize images for you? So we actually had the conversation with the Next.js team quite a bit. He wrote a number of design docs, we iterated on it, and then we both had the shared idea that, okay, this is a great thing, let's work on it, right? And at the same time, while we're doing all of this, we also we try to be aware of all the newer APIs that come out, all the newer direction and things they're doing. For example, Next 13, the app layout, the app directory layouts, right? So whenever we're shipping features, we also try to make sure we understand exactly what's happening behind the scenes because A, it should fall seamlessly with their existing tooling. And we never want to ship something that wouldn't work with, say, a new version, a new feature in a version of the framework. So we try our best to just mold ourselves into their team in a way where we're helpful. But it's always a working process.
And I want to focus on that process for just one more question. Is there a project manager that is driving this? Is there a backlog? Like, how do you prioritize these features? I'm just very curious about how this is working with one meeting a week. Is it like that with all the other teams?
It depends on the team. So with the Next.js folks, we'll try to have, and this has changed, right? Like a lot of the times we'll try to just improve our process. They'll give us ideas, we'll give them some ideas. So we have a shared channel, Slack channel. We'll just talk there about anything we need to do. And then we'll try to have now at least sort of high-level monthly syncs. Think about, okay, just high-level direction. What are you guys working on? What are we working on? Is there anything we need to stay aligned on? And then we'll have smaller syncs with specific folks in our team and specific folks of their team, right? So one of them could be, let's say, third-party script mitigation, right? Like, how can a framework like Next.js mitigate third-party impact? So we'll get somebody from their team that's actually kind of involved in that space. Someone in our team will discuss, we'll share ideas. And yeah, so I think to also answer your question, We try to also very early in the year share our goals and like a roadmap and our OKRs will say, this is what we're thinking of for the year, right? We'd love to see this land for the React ecosystem. We think, for example, Next.js is the perfect place to land it. Maybe here's a very rough idea of how it could look like. And many times they might just be honest and say, no, that's not the right direction. Let's think about it another way. But the one amazing thing about working with the Next.js team is they're usually very supportive of newer ideas, which I think is great, right? There's so many people using the framework. It's very easy to make mistakes. We have shipped things where we've had to realize, okay, maybe we've got to roll back something. Maybe the API isn't perfect. But they're very responsive to ideas, which is a good start. And then as we have come up with new ideas, we'll reiterate when we need to.
So it's really about finding an equilibrium between the features that you want to build from all sides of the aisle of the feature or the improvement or whatever it is that's being built, and then just finding alignment there and just working directly on the open source projects, because these are all open source projects.
Exactly.
Right? So it's not like you're in a back room like working on the next greatest thing.
Exactly.
Interesting. What was I going to say? I can move on to my next question, but I had a really good one, really good follow-up to that. Let me move on to the next one.
I'll come back to you, hopefully.
Yes, features. How much of this is actually focused on features and building new features for the web, like the image component, versus other metrics?
Yeah, I think the majority of our work, I would say, will be described by the features we ship. And sometimes, so again, the best way for us to ship a feature is for them to not even need to opt in. It's something where if they upgrade to the later version, they automatically get the benefits, right? So that's the ideal scenario. And then there's other times like the image component where they'll have to import something to use. But again, we try to keep that low friction as possible. So the bulk of our work are feature driven, right? We'll have these high level goals in Chrome, high level things, and we'll be like, okay, how can we mold and make this something that works in the framework, right? How can React developers use this? Is it a hook? Is it a component? Is it a library they need to import, right? So like that's the kind of thinking we'll need to do. So that's the bulk of our work. A lot of the times we're not also doing necessarily that, but what we could be doing is, say Chrome is shipping a new API, right? We're like, hey, this is brand new API. We want developers to use it. Because of where Aurora stands in sort of the middle, right? We'll just naturally try to think about how this can work in the framework. Even if we don't try to ship that specific API, we'll let the Next.js team or any framework team know. We'll be like, okay, there's this new thing shipping. Is this useful? Do you like it? Does it not make sense? If not, we'll try to bring that back to the engineering team in Chrome and be like, this sounds great, but unfortunately, it's not going to work for the React ecosystem. Here's the reasons why, right? So we try to do that sometimes. We don't do that for the majority of our work, but I think that's also very naturally useful because while we have those conversations, we're helping Chrome engineers think about what's happening in the developer ecosystem. And at the same time, we're also letting framework authors know about what's coming out, right? Because many times they'll be shipping their features, but they might not be aware of a brand new web API that's coming out. And then, if all works well, we'll think about maybe having that API ship in a specific component or something that actually works for everyone.
Is Aurora actively working on Chrome as well, or is Aurora just a bridge between Chrome and the frameworks?
Mostly the bridge. There have been certain instances where we have shipped certain things into Chromium. One example would be we also try to do a lot of metrics analysis. So using Chrome's internal pipeline, I've helped ship ways for like Chrome to detect what framework is being used behind the scenes. Obviously, this is all behind still meeting privacy considerations. So that's something we do sometimes, but usually it's only to help us for something. So the bulk of our work isn't on Chromium, even though we're still under the Chrome umbrella, but we'll do that whenever you need it to assist our work.
And how do you determine who to work with?
In terms of like actual frameworks and framework authors, it's an ongoing conversation. We were very fortunate to decide to start working with the React ecosystem and naturally have that conversation with the Next.js team. We've had conversations with the Gatsby team. We've had a few conversations with the Remix team. I would love for us to work with all these frameworks, right? There's so many newer things coming out. Ben gave a great talk on Astro, right? There's Quick, there's Solid, there's so much. So because we're so strapped and we don't have that many members and engineers in our team, we can't naturally work with every new tool that comes out. I think every week there's something new that's on Twitter that even I try to keep up with. But what we try to do is we try to see where the ecosystem is headed. And then we'll try to actually see, okay, is there a value in us having that conversation with that specific team, right? Like Vite is a good example. It's being widely used. We've had normal conversations with them. We're trying to figure out, okay, is there anything that we can do directly in Vite? Is there something we can do on top of it? Should it stay in the framework layer? So it's usually an ongoing conversation. And it also, we try to make sure that whenever we establish these conversations, that whoever replies is responsive. And again, we don't want to make it seem like we're telling people what to do. Many times if you reach out with a request, if they don't think it's the right time, that's totally fine. We'll revisit discussion later. But we definitely, I think, reach out to more people to start with, and then we'll try to narrow down to see where the best fit is.
Do you see the team growing?
I do. I think there's definitely room for more engineers on our team. I think with everything in the tech ecosystem now, it's hard to see that growth in the near term, but I'm hopeful in the long term we can have our team being a much bigger presence in Chrome.
When you announced the web framework ecosystem in 2019, you selected Next.js as the first framework to start working with. Nearly 4 years later, as a result of this direct collaboration, what are the advancements in Next.js that you're most proud of?
Yeah, there's definitely a few features. One of them being the image component. I think that was one of the most widely received, positively received features that we helped ship. Ralph, another engineer on our team, shipped a script component. And it had a very similar idea where a lot of the times folks using Next.js want to import a third-party script, right? And usually when folks think about third parties, they try to think of it as a separate thing as the core framework they're using. But we thought, why can't we bridge it a bit better, right? What if there was components that would automatically control and make sure that the script loads after the page becomes interactive? And then if you needed to load critically before the page becomes interactive, you have a prop to do so. So that's another thing that we've shipped that we're really happy about. I'm really hopeful in seeing that even evolve. I do have some ideas, and I think for the next few quarters, I'm going to try to think about ways, could developers even just have wrapper components to, like, let's say if they want to import Google Tag Manager or Google Analytics or Facebook Embed, what if there were simple components they can import and plug in and not worry about all the external details, and everything happens and works behind the scene. So that's an ongoing discussion. Gerald and our team actually worked with a few of the React folks and Next.js folks very early on server components. I think he helped with some of the direction. He had some very early ideas on where that should be headed and how it should look like. And then we've had some other things that haven't fully shipped that are still experimental. Ralph also shipped a feature that automatically, you have to enable the flag, but it automatically identifies what the critical CSS of the page is, and then actually injects that into the head and loads that first. And we think that's a good example of a feature that automatically happens, but you wouldn't have to do any necessary work. So I think that's some of our core features. One other thing that I did early on was I helped ship the ESLint plugin. So one term that we use very heavily in Google is the word conformance. And the idea was whatever tool you're using, it should give you the right warnings and the right errors at the right time. So we thought about how can that apply to the general web framework ecosystem. So I tried thinking about that in the context of Next.js. I helped ship the specific ESLint plugin, as well as just any external warnings in the terminal. So I helped around there. Very happy about that. I also want to see that evolve to some degree. So I'm kind of hopeful there. So we've kind of had our hands in a lot of different places. But we've definitely had more, I think, a number of features that received some pretty widespread adoption. And then as we continue working on Next.js, we also try to take a step back and be like, OK, this worked really well in Next.js. How can we apply this in other frameworks, in other React frameworks, as well as other frameworks in general?
Yeah, so great segue to my next question. Is there crossover there? Are you learning something from Vite and from Vue that you're bringing over to React or vice versa?
I think definitely vice versa, because the bulk of our work naturally starts most of the time with React and Next.js. But there have been a lot of things that we've tried to spread to other frameworks. We've used a lot of the learnings in the Next.js image component to ship something kind of similar in Angular called the image directive. Very similar idea, works as a directive, but the idea is if you wanted to use images in Angular and automatically get benefits behind the scenes, that would do it for you. Very early on, before we even shipped any of these features, Alex also helped out in the engineering team. He helped improve how Next.js chunks a lot of the bundles, and makes them sort of make sure that you're not shipping more for the page that you need. So you're getting things a bit more granular. Gatsby folks actually saw that. We had a conversation with them, and they did something very similar in Gatsby, which we were very happy to see. So in all the work that we do, we try our best to see it spread. Sometimes it doesn't make sense, right? If something's more one framework specific, it's a lot harder to see it expand. But we always try to think of ways of, if it works very well in this one framework, chances are it's also going to be working very well in something else.
Do you see yourself working with smaller React frameworks like Remix or Shopify's Hydrogen?
We do. We've had a number of conversations with the Hydrogen team. We've met the Remix team a few times as well. I think we do. If we had more folks on the Aurora team, we would also be more embedded in all of these frameworks. But because we don't, we just naturally have to try to focus on one more than the others. But what we try to do is every single time we ship something, we'll at least have that conversation with other frameworks. We could definitely do a better job, but we always try to reach out to the other React teams and say, okay, we've shipped something. Can you see this work in your framework? If not, why? What can we do to change it? So that's something I hope we can continue seeing in the coming years. So even if we don't actually do the engineering work, at least they can actually see what we've landed and we can help them and steer them in the right direction.
And how does your work here affect other browsers? Of course, Brave is just same thing. So I think it's going to be one-to-one, right? Just, I guess, a little more private, non-Google. I don't know. But Safari, are there any downstream effects, beneficial downstream effects to Safari and Arc and other browsers like that?
Yeah, I think all the work that we do, because we naturally work with open source tooling, right? Like we have to make sure nothing we're doing is Chrome specific. It has to work for the entire web, right? The web has to be open regardless of what browser you use. So for every single feature we've shipped, we've naturally made sure that this isn't something that's Chrome specific, right? It's an open source tool feature, and regardless of what browser you use, you should get the same benefit. There's another effort that we're also kind of helping out with. It's called Speedometer. It's not, I think, Aurora specific, but it's just about benchmarking browsers. And we're working with Mozilla and we're working with Safari on that. But I think that's just an example of if there's ways for us to do cross-browser collaboration, we will. But if we're working with the open source ecosystem, naturally, we want it to work in every browser.
React Server Components, announced in 2020, released 2022, just a few months ago. Did the Aurora team have any hand in that?
Yeah, Gerald and our team did have some input, and he kind of helped think about sort of the vision. They definitely, I think, had, like the Next.js team definitely took it and made it, I think, mostly their own. I think the one thing that he kind of helped out was the early thought process behind it. And then the Next.js team did a great job of actually thinking about how it works for the developer, right? Like when you think of React Server Components, they thought about ways of, okay, maybe an app directory and layouts and actually having server files. So I think they took care of a lot of the details. One thing that we are trying to do, though, moving forward is as we ship new features, we need to make sure that it also works for both pre-Next.js 13, pre-app directory, as well as future, right? So I think a lot of the partners that we talk to, either they upgrade to Next 13 and they're just not ready to jump to the app directory, and that's totally fine. So we have to make sure the features we ship also work for them. But we also need to make sure that it's future-proof to some degree, right? Like the script component is one example. Sebastian from the Next.js team helped us a lot making sure that it also works for newer developers. But anytime we think of new features now, we have to make sure, okay, it actually fits into their model and it isn't something that's completely separate that just wouldn't work with server components.
I'll move on to one more subject, and then we'll open up to audience Q&A. So get those questions ready. Donovan will run around with the mic for you. Artificial intelligence. Let's talk a little bit about that. How is the Aurora team planning for this brave new world we find ourselves in? How are you integrating Bard or other technologies into your workflow now, and how do you see it being integrated into the future?
Yeah, so Google's, not Chrome, but Google definitely shipped a number of cool tools, right? Like Bard being one of them. Just a few days ago, they shipped the Palm API and Maker Suite, and they sort of announced that as well. So there's a lot of teams in Google, including Chrome, that are kind of thinking of where generative AI can move forward, right? For Aurora, it's still very early days. We're thinking, we don't have anything, I think, very concrete planned, but we are trying to think ahead, right? Like, can AI help the developer in any way? Can it help them in their developer tooling? Can it help them directly in the browser? Can it actually fit in their mold of building a site using a framework? So we're having those discussions. Still very early days. I can't really say anything as of now, but I'm hopeful we might actually do something in the near term for that.
Oh, what about that announcement that for salesman teasing? You know anything about that?
Which announcement? There've been so many.
They're filming one of their new things this week, so no
I
insights
do
into
no
that.
insights on
Lips
that
sealed.
one, even though it looks pretty cool. Seeing them all sit in the room.
All right, that's it for me. Let's give it up for Hussein, everyone.
So if you have questions, raise your hand, and we'll get Molly on that side, and I can get this side.
Let's wait for the mic so we can get you on the live stream. Go ahead.
Hey, hi. I wanted to know, do you see yourself working with individual node packages, such as like React Google Maps, which is like quite independent right now and like quite outdated? So these packages which have like direct impact on Google's business and like integration. So do you see yourself like working with them?
That's a good question. I think that would depend on the context of the library, of the dependency. I think the short answer would be not usually, because it's hard to try to improve a single tool, a single library, and then try to get and see it grow in adoption, right? So we try to do things from the top-down approach of like what the framework can do so that anybody using gets the benefits. So we try to sort of put most of our eggs in that basket. The longer answer, though, is I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is for like that example, we are trying to think of ways of, could the framework do something where, say you needed to load Google Maps and you don't need to use a third-party library? That is something we're trying to think of, right? Like, can Next.js do something? So I think that's kind of where we're trying to focus on. And if we do that, it will be super nice if we can actually find something where, the Next.js team wouldn't have to, let's say, or any framework team, wouldn't have to think about maintaining something like that, right? Maybe we can have an external source for like how to optimize or load a Google Maps embed in the most optimized way. And then Next.js can just have the right tool chain to plug that in. So we think about it more top-down. So yeah, that's a long answer. I hope that sort of answered your question.
Anybody else? Any other questions? Don't be shy.
Khaled, this is a really great conversation you guys are having. I'm wondering, aside from the framework in themselves, there's a lot of debugging tools or extension that they come with. Is there any improvement in those tools to improve the developer experience?
Yeah, so we also have some conversations with folks working on developer tooling. We met, I think very recently, we also try to meet with people who work on the React DevTools extension. So we don't, I think from Aurora perspective, we don't spend too much time trying to improve those tools ourselves. We think of things, again, we try to improve the core framework as much as possible. I think if we had more bandwidth, we would definitely spread to specific tooling. But the thing I think we try to do with external tooling like that is we try to bridge them to people who work on Chrome DevTools to the best of our ability. So a lot of the times, people in Chrome DevTools would ask us and say, we want to ship something or improve something that can make it easier for React developers to debug their site, right? Maybe they need, I don't know, better source maps, or maybe they need better ways to find the right line of code. So we'll try to actually bridge the conversation with, let's say, the React DevTools team. And then we'll try to figure out what's missing in either Chrome, the browser itself, or what's missing in, let's say, the DevTools extension. And then we'll try to find a solution to that. Is it a newer API? Is it something that the browser can do? Is there something that we can do to make their lives easier? So that's kind of like the degree of the work we've done there. But I can't say we've actually shipped actual implementation and features on those tools.
Hey, I'm Ben from earlier. But yeah, this has been a really great conversation. Of course, as someone who like maintains a meta framework, it's interesting to hear about this stuff. And I'm kind of curious about y'all's process around like making core web vitals and deciding on them. I think there's even a new experimental one around layout shift. I forget the exact name. But like through your work with other frameworks, are web vitals informed by what those frameworks are doing? Are they meant to even challenge them or sort of steer them in a new direction? Like what's the relationship there?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're super fortunate to work very closely with the Speed Metrics team. They envision and design these new APIs. Like you mentioned, there's one still in the works for scrolling. And there's another one about interaction to Next Paint, which is sort of a successor to first input delay. Like, can it measure all the interactions throughout the page lifecycle and see how long it's taken for things to interact? So I think the Chrome speed metrics team will think about it from a high level, right? They're not thinking about it necessarily from a framework perspective, because it actually has to work throughout the web. That being said, what we try to do in the Aurora team is, because we use these metrics as sort of our success metrics, we're very in tune to see if there's anything that's missing. And an example was, I think a couple of years ago, what we did was we found out that the largest contentful paint metric wasn't accurately picking up Angular hydrated content on the page. So that kind of helped us investigate, okay, there might be an issue with the metric, and they actually shipped a bug fix. So that's kind of an example of ways we try to improve those metrics. Because we're so in tune with these frameworks directly, if we see anything that's slightly off or just doesn't work, we'll try to bring that feedback back to them. But because they work very closely with us, naturally they'll also be very sort of up to date with what's happening, and say, let's say React server components, if there's anything there as an example that needs to be measured, or is not being picked up by these metrics, we'll try to assess it from a case by case basis.
Makes sense.
Excellent question. Any others? We got one in the back over there.
Hi, Sharif here. I just have a quick question. So you mentioned working with other browsers. How do you maintain a competitive advantage while also fostering these partnerships with these other browsers?
Yeah, so the work that we do, we don't try to maintain a competitive advantage, and it might sound contradictory. But if you think about it, the work that we do, if we improve the tools developers use, and if that improves the web experience for Chrome, for Safari, for Firefox, everybody wins, right? So nothing that we do, we try to make sure that Chrome stands out in any way. And I think it's also just very natural by the work that we do. So we don't try to at all think about that in any way. We are a web team, right? Like, even though we fall under the Chrome umbrella, we think of ourselves as the web team or a web team. So all the work that we do, we try to stay and think about the open web to the best of our ability. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question fully, but we don't at all think about that.
All right, I think about that about wraps it up. Let's give it up for Hussein again, everyone. From the Google Chrome Aurora team.
Thank you.
Excellent chatting with you.